GIT 500, Ethical Issues in Data Collection. What do we mean by ethics? Well, there's two ways to think of ethics. There are codes of ethics, or code of ethics, and that's basically just a set of guidelines which talks about values and needs and expectations of anybody who has a stake in whatever profession we're applying these ethics to. So this is aspirational. These are the things that should happen. And then there is a code of conduct, and that is specific direction on how specific practices and behavior should occur. So one is aspirational, the other one is directional. One thing to remember about ethics is that they are ever changing. What was ethical in the past may not be ethical right now. What's ethical now may not be considered ethical in the future. Within the ethical principles of conduct, we define ethical practice as how things are done within a practice. It's the behavior of the professional, whatever the profession is. Unethical behavior is behavior that causes harm, it breaches confidentialities, or misuses information that somebody has provided in confidential situations. When we're talking about research, we often talk about the stakeholders. Stakeholders can refer to a lot of different groups, but in research, these are the people who are involved with or affected by the research. This can be participants or subjects in the research study. It also includes researchers and also funding organizations that may have contributed money to the research. We have to consider, as researchers, any ethical issues that can arise when any of those three groups of stakeholders are concerned. So the first one we'll talk about is participants, and one of the biggest possible ethical issues is data collection. So as researchers, we need to ask ourselves, how is that data going to be collected? Are we going to do surveys, interviews, focus groups, and so on? We have to consider how it makes the participant feel. Are we asking personal questions that might make them feel uncomfortable? A big one is, are all the questions that we're asking relevant to the research? Sometimes we ask things that we think might be interesting, but aren't really directly related to the research question that we have. We also have to do something which is called informed consent. Getting informed consent from our participants, we have to do some certain things. We have to explain what kind of information we will be asking for, why that information is needed, how it will be used, what its purpose is, what the participants themselves have to do. Are they going to do surveys, interviews, so on? And how may that participation affect them and make them feel? And lastly, that participation is voluntary and without pressure, and that they can start participating and then for any reason at any time stop without a problem. So this is like the heart of getting data from participants. You need to get informed consent, and you need to explain these things. Another thing is incentives. We hear sometimes, well, to get participants, can I give them things? Can I pay them some money or give them a card or a gift card or something? So we have to ask the question, is it ethical to provide incentives to respondents for sharing information with you as the researcher? You can give gifts like gift cards or even payments after participation it's not really unethical as long as you give everybody the same gift, right? So you can't say, well, I'm going to only use this person's data and that person's data and that person's data, so I'm just going to pay them. You can't do that. First of all, you wouldn't only use certain people's data. You can say, okay, for this $10 Target card, everybody will get one for participating. It's usually okay. Other ethical issues that might arise might be from participant harm and from confidentiality issues. Participant harm means that you are going to try your best not to harm the participant in any way. So you have to ask yourself, is the research going to harm participants in any way, whether it's physical, puts them in danger, or mental anguish, anything like that. You got to figure that out ahead of time. Ways to do that is to make sure any risk is minimal. So if they give up personal information, that they can't be identified and that kind of thing, and that the risk that they're taking is no more than normal in daily life. If the research itself and the questions that are being asked, either the topic of the research or the questions that are possibly going to be asked, causes anxiety or harassment feelings in your participants, do your best to try to resolve those. And if participants can't get past that, it might be best if either they leave the study or you change the study. I alluded to this a little bit before, that you need to ensure confidentiality. That lowers the risk and lowers the possible participant harm. You really don't want to identify individual responses or information, so and link those to individuals in most cases. That means you report the data that you collect from individuals in aggregate. An aggregate means that you just put all that data together. So there are no individuals at that point. It's just data. And if you do have to use individuals, like maybe you're doing a before and after study and you want to study, you want to see the before data for participant X and the after data for participant X, you can still name them but replace the names and any other identifying information with anonymous information, so that if for some reason you did publish the paper and it got into a journal, nobody would be able to figure out who you were talking to or talking about in your research. Switching to researchers and the ethical issues that we need to be concerned with, we're going to talk about bias and treatment selection. A lot of time when you're talking about bias, people think subjectivity is different from bias. It is not necessarily the same thing. Your bias can be shown in your subjectivity, but really subjectivity just means that we all have come from a different point in our lives of how we're raised, where we were raised, really our ethnicity, that kind of thing. Doesn't mean that it is necessarily wrong to be subjective. Bias, on the other hand, is deliberately hiding what you find in a study or highlighting something that you do favor disproportionately based on your own beliefs or what you want the outcome of your research to show. It can also be hiding information about yourself that might introduce a bias. So you might be doing research on, using Microsoft products in the classroom, but you might have a bias that you own Microsoft stock that you did not reveal. So that is a bias. It's different from subjectivity. Subjectivity can be okay as long as it's acknowledged and doesn't show favor. That is completely ethical to be biased, right? We all know that. As far as treatment of participants, in our subject areas, that's not usually a problem because we don't give treatments. But like in the medical field, when they do research, they will often have two different groups, and one will get the actual drug and the other one will get a placebo. That is okay as long as participants know that this could happen, but it has to be done anonymously. Like, you can't just say, well, I'm going to give the drug to all the males but not to all the females. You can't do that. That's unfair, unethical treatment of participants. Researchers also have to be careful to not use inappropriate methodology. That is just using the incorrect methodology that's not appropriate for what you are trying to discover or prove or whatever, or using methodology in a way that is incorrect. For example, if you selected a biased sample for participants that you know will answer a certain way that favors the outcome that you would like, that is not ethical. Or using a survey that asks biased questions, that is also not ethical. And then the big one that we see in the news, unfortunately too often, is researchers manipulating data to make it come out the way that they want it to come out. Also, the funding org, that last group of stakeholders that we talked about, they can also use or encourage the researcher or insist that the researcher use an incorrect methodology or use the methodology in an incorrect way by also selecting a biased sample, using surveys that ask biased questions, and manipulating the data. Restrictions on research can be imposed by funding organizations. It's additional things that happen. They might insist on selecting the methodology, even though you as a researcher may know that is incorrect. They don't allow findings to be published, or they push for different findings, and that's where that manipulating of data can come in. Or they take your data and misuse it, your findings, to benefit themselves or their organization. The reason why this happens is because they're giving money to the researcher to do this research, and they basically hold all the power. Now let's talk about getting data from secondary sources. This is anything that you use in your research that you did not get directly from participants. So that is any information that's from any source but yourself, and that always needs to be cited. There needs to be citations in anything you write down. So papers and literature reviews has to be cited and attributed to that other source. And failure to do so leads to plagiarism. That is what plagiarism is. Okay? That's using someone else's work and claiming it to be your own. And even if you don't outwardly, consciously claim it to be your own, not giving a proper citation is the same thing. Because you're saying, this is how it is, and so I must have come up with that. That's wrong. And again, just usually that happens when you just forget to put a citation in a research paper. You can still get accused of plagiarism. So you really have to be careful of that. They're very, that's a big deal in graduate school, particularly, if you're going to be a scholar or if you're going to work for a company and do research for them, you have to cite secondary sources. The best way to avoid plagiarism is to provide in-text citations, and do that for any information, all information taken from any other source, whether you use it directly in quotations or indirectly. You just use the information. This includes sources that are, papers or articles that you get from academic journals, any information from websites, from books, and so on. And what I mean by direct or indirectly, we're basically talking about quotes. So that's quoting information from your source. An indirect quote is using the information from the secondary source, but not using the wording from that secondary source. So here's an indirect quote. I use Harry Potter for an example. The students of the 4 Hogwarts houses do not always get along. That comes from a source. I didn't provide the citation, but I want to give you that as an example. And direct quote, where it's actually in quotes and I got it directly from the source. A great deal of rivalry existed between the houses, not always friendly. All right, so indirect or direct, you have to cite both. So misrepresentation of data also happens. So you might get data and you might cite it properly, but you may not present it in the same way so that you can get a different interpretation. So here's an example of a group that is anti-abortion, and they're critical Planned Parenthood. Whatever your beliefs are, that's not what we're talking about really. But if you can see, it looks like in this that cancer screening and prevention services is way down and abortions is way up, right? So if you look on this chart, but if you look at the numbers at the 2013 abortions, it's 327,000. But cancer screenings is actually is at 935. This chart is just totally screwed up. It just is done to make it, you can tell there's no values on the left-hand side, which there should be. Here's the actual chart that was presented by Planned Parenthood. Same numbers, but they actually have over on the left the values, and you can see abortions really actually didn't go up that much. Yes, cancer screening and prevention services went down quite a bit, but abortions relatively did not go up. And so this one on the left totally misrepresents the data. So you have to be careful. That is not ethical either. There are groups that oversee these kind of issues. It's called internal review boards. They are, or IRB for short. The role of those is to review all proposed research involving human subjects to ensure that subjects are treated ethically and that the rights and welfare of those individuals are adequately protected. At ASU, it is the ASU Office of Research Integrity and Assurance. All big companies that do research will have an internal review board to do this kind of work for you. Here at ASU, we have the ASU IRB, but there's a lot of conflicting information on whether you need to do this for your study, if you do like an applied project or you do some other kind of research while you're a graduate study. And so we ask ourselves, when do you need to get IRB approval for your study? Well, if your research is and the procedures are low risk or no risk, basically you're sending out a survey, or maybe you're doing Zoom interviews. Those are pretty low risk. The experience of writing the research paper, that objective for that is to provide you, the students, with training about and experience with research methods. That's what the ending research study and paper for this course is, right? So for this course, you would not need to get IRB approval. You might for your applied project if you do one. The other key is if you do applied project, or even the one in this course, this research paper, study and paper, that the data that you gather and put into your project will not be used, published, or otherwise disseminated outside of the classroom. So they have here in this thing, she says, survey results will not be shared outside of my classroom. So that means you do not have to get IRB approval. However, if you plan on publishing your research as an article, like maybe in a journal, or maybe you did something that pertains to your workplace, and you want to share it with your employer, you would have to pass it through IRB. Very often, if it's still like surveys and that kind of things, the things we do, even if that's the case, it gets expedited and approved. You'll want to talk that over with your graduate committee chair if you are doing a PRIDE project and you think you might want to share your results. There are 3 protected classes in participants that you have to go through IRBs no matter what. And those are pregnant women, neonates, which are newborns, or even fetuses if you're doing. Now, we don't really necessarily do that. If you want to do research on prisoners specifically, they're a protected class because they don't have the ability to, decline basically. And then children, which is anybody under the 8 years of 18, so 17 and under, because those are minors. And if you want to do that, you have to take the extra step of also getting parental consent. Which just means you have to take their IRB so they approve, and then you have to get the parental consent from every individual, every child that is in your study. That takes more time, so I encourage, especially for this class, don't do anything for any, that involves participants of 17 and under, because it takes a long time to get that done. All right, so what we talked about in this presentation is, the codes of ethics and behavior, the way ethics affect the different stakeholders of participants, researchers, and funding organizations, how to avoid committing plagiarism, and all about internal review boards.